Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. It's Friday's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franke, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, CMI, and I'm delighted that today my guests are Professor Susan Vinnicombe of Cranfield University and Dr. Elena Doldor, Reader in Organisational Behaviour at Queen Mary University, and they are the authors of the very recently published Female FTSE Board Report. So welcome to you, Susan and Elena.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. So, Susan, you've been monitoring this, the progress of women on boards for quite a number of years now. What are the recent findings in your latest research regarding women on boards? What are the good aspects, maybe some less good aspects? You know, what do you think are the reasons behind that?
Well, thank you, Anne. Yes, every year what we do is to analyse the progress of women on board, and each year we also take a special project. So this year, many of you may not realise this, but actually the UK stands out as probably the only main country in the world that's adopted voluntary targets as a means to progress women's diversity on boards and senior leadership roles, compared to many other countries that went the mandatory quota route. So we thought it'd be interesting to have a look at how companies in particular are actually using voluntary targets. And that's a project that was led by Elena, and I'll pass over to her in a few minutes to talk about that. But let me start at the beginning with looking at the progress of women on boards. And as Anne so rightly says, I have been doing this for many years. In 1999, I kicked it off when I don't think anyone was speaking about women on boards at all, whereas now it's really a very hot debate. So I think the very good news this year is that FTSE 350 companies are clearly going to hit and have hit the Hampton-Alexander target of 33% women on board. And, you know, I don't think we should underestimate that achievement. 10 years ago in 2010, FTSE 100 only had 12.5% women on the boards. So we're at just over 35% now. So we've really almost trebled the number of women on board. So that is a great achievement. But there's always a but, of course.
Yes.
And behind that great achievement, I think, are two very disappointing ones. I think the general piece is that women are simply not getting the big jobs, the senior roles. So if we think of the board as consisting of primarily non-executive directors, and then there are a few executive directors, women are making very tiny progress on the executive director side. Around about, I mean, this year, FTSE 100 have got around 13% women executive directors. At the time of writing the report, there were only 5 women CEOs. That has climbed to a grand total of 7 now. But, you know, when we think about it, that 93% of FTSE 100 CEOs are men, it really is quite appalling. And then
and just to clarify, executive directors, for those listening, those are the members, senior management team members on the executive committee. So the ones doing the actual running of the company as opposed to the board members.
Yes, thank you, Anne. So the big progress is obviously with the non-executive directors. So now just over 40% of non-executive directors on all FTSE 350 boards are women. And yet, isn't it interesting, if we look at FTSE 100, where women have climbed onto those boards earlier than FTSE 250, only 8 women are chairing those committees, chairing those boards. So I have to ask myself, and we do ask ourselves regularly, why it is that women are getting on boards but not getting the big jobs. So is it kind of glass ceilings within glass ceilings? I mean, you have to ask yourself, are these just kind of tokenistic or symbolic appointments? Is it a matter of time? I mean, I have to say that women have been on FTSE 100 boards for many years now, and it is, I think, very dispiriting to see the lack of progress of women in these senior roles. And they are important, as Anne has just explained. Executive directors are the ones who really run the business. And I know that when Lord Davis and then later Hampton Alexander reviews set up, it wasn't just about getting lots of women and gender diversity on the boards. It was about impacting gender diversity in all the senior levels. And what we did do this year was a special study on looking at whether having a critical mass of women on the boards actually does increase the number of women in the executive pipeline. And perhaps not surprising to many of you, it's not just enough to have a critical number of women. You've got to have women in influential roles like those CEO and other big executive director roles to make a difference. So
Right.
that's a sort of quick summary.
Okay, so moving the needle without having women in those key executive roles and chair roles is going to be that much harder, is what you're saying, despite the great overall progress.
I think that's absolutely right, Anne, because as you say, the executive directors are the ones who run the business day to day. They have the voice, the bigger voice at the table. And so I think unless we see women there, I'm really feel concerned about whether we'll make real progress.
Well, now, Elena, you've looked into the effectiveness of targets, and targets are becoming quite prevalent. As Susan said, the UK is unique in that, using voluntary targets to make progress. So what do you think? Do they work? What's their role? What impact do they have? And what else do we need to move the needle?
Yeah, so we've examined this year in the report the use of voluntary targets by interviewing senior leaders who had significant responsibility in driving targets in their organizations, whether they were D&I leaders or operational leaders of specific business units. And I think the good news overall is that targets are generally becoming normalized business practice. So there wasn't as much resistance as perhaps we expected in those organizations that did use them for a while. There are 3 points that I think are interesting to draw out here. One is, how do we sell targets? So we've learned that diversity targets are more easily accepted if we remind people that we have tangible objectives and targets for pretty much any meaningful goal in business, and diversity really shouldn't be an exception. And it's also helpful to address that meritocracy issue, which comes up over and over again when we talk to people about targets. This myth that somehow targets undermine meritocracy in the workplace. They don't undermine it, they enable it by leveling that playing field. That's the short answer to that. But I do think it needs to be addressed head on when we introduce targets. The other point is accountability. So we have a corporate target. Who is supposed to achieve that big target? So we see organizations very keen to foster accountability for meeting targets, but there's a bit of unease about how to achieve this. Organizations with a bit more experience in utilizing targets were comfortable hardwiring target achievement to leadership performance appraisal, but that really wasn't widespread practice in those organizations that were just starting to use this practice. So I think it's a good question for an organization to ask themselves, how do we make leaders accountable for this? And finally, there's the point of, do targets contribute to culture change or not, or are they just a sort of tick box exercise? What we've seen is that targets force those organizations to have more data-driven approaches to making people decisions. They force them to scrutinize bias across a variety of talent management processes, from recruitment to promotions and leadership development. And also they expanded the focus of organizations across talent pipelines below senior levels. Because ultimately, we talk a lot about targets at leadership level, but I think the value of targets ultimately is to force organizations to ask themselves how they should develop, recruit, promote talent at junior and mid-career levels in order to have that leadership balance 5 or 10 years down the line. So I think it's helping them kind of take a systemic approach and ask the right questions about the talent pipelines.
Great. So that's a really good analysis of how to use targets. Now, of course, we are in the middle of COVID. And I'd really like to ask both of you, starting with you, Susan, as we move through this pandemic, what can we do to accelerate progress? Do you think COVID helps or hinders progress? Susan, what do you think?
Well, I don't think COVID has particularly affected the appointment of women onto boards. I mean, and let's think about why that is. I mean, it's because these are part-time positions and they've got term limits attached to them. So they're a little different from actually recruiting someone and developing people in the executive pipeline. So I have real concerns about the effects of COVID. I mean, there's been a lot of media attention to just how women are having to take on quite often the lion's share of the caring responsibilities at home. And so I think it's been enormously stressful for women. So I think in moving forward through this pandemic, organizations need to be super cognizant of just, reaching out to everyone, but particularly the women who I think are shouldering a lot of stress. And this week, I see the new publication of the McKinsey report, which is specifically on COVID. And it's very worrying to read that table on how many women are talking about reducing hours at work, going part-time, and sadly, thinking of leaving the workforce because just of the stress of dealing with it. So yes, very worried about it.
Sure. Elena, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just to add a complementary point to Susan's points, I think there's an opportunity and a danger. So for instance, flexible working is becoming normalized, and there's an opportunity there to rethink creatively how we work and how we organize ourselves. And yet we shouldn't forget this is gendered, yeah? And so flexible working, remote working is having unequal strains on men versus women. And we see awareness of this amongst organizations. What we don't see yet is tangible action about addressing this. So I think we do need to proactively put the effects of the pandemic on the D&I agenda, including the intersectional effects, by the way. So not just women, but women of color and employees of color as well. So there's a couple of things to document the impact that the differential impact the pandemic has on women's careers, to take on tangible action and address the long-term effects on the pipelines of female talent. I think we're not going to see it necessarily in a year or two, but I doubt we will be able to sustain this upwards kind of trajectory towards more gender balanced leadership unless we do that. And I think it's to invest aggressively into women's careers and leadership development right now. I think with the economic uncertainty the crisis brings, it's going to be very, very tempting for organizations to halt their investment in the D&I agenda. And actually, I think now is the moment to double down on those commitments rather than back away from them.
And that's a great point. And, my next question relates to this. We know that diversity does deliver better business results and better results altogether. And our research has shown an increase in the importance of empathy and communication as a leadership style that more and more managers are displaying during this crisis. Now, do you think we're seeing a shift in the paradigm of leadership in the pandemic? Susan, what do you think?
Well, I sincerely hope so. I mean, the last 40 or 50 years, we've been plagued with this major stereotype of think manager, think male. And I think what's been fascinating recently is all the attention that a number of female political leaders have got on how effectively they have managed the pandemic and, managing countries where the death rate has been significantly lower. Significantly. I mean, I know that a number of them manage small countries like Norway or New Zealand or Iceland. But, look at Angela Merkel. Exactly. I mean, Germany's roughly the same size as the UK. And I think it's around about 2,500 deaths in Germany. And we're currently on 42,000. So we're not talking about marginal differences here. So I am hoping that the attention that these women are getting, these female political leaders are getting, are making us stop and think about these leadership styles. You're quite right, Anne. I think, you know, communication has been seen to be a very important ingredient to leadership right now. Collaboration, this ability to say, I don't know what the answer is to this problem. I mean, that's, I think, an issue which has plagued, I think, a number of our male political leaders, in insisting that we're going to have groundbreaking systems when we don't actually know how to create them in the first place. That we'd much prefer to hear that actually we're in this together, we'll be working collaboratively with experts. So I am optimistic. I'm hoping that we will shift in our view of what makes a good leader.
And Elena, do you share Susan's optimism, or what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those positive examples of female heads of state have really shown us how women leaders can balance that very tight, acceptable line of female leadership behavior that is both decisive, assertive, and empathetic and caring. And especially, I appreciated the deference to evidence and to expertise, which I would like to see more in public decision making. And I hope that, you know, the positive examples of female leadership we're seeing now do broaden our collective understanding of what good leadership should look like in corporate settings, political settings. Ironically, you know, as we see this congratulatory media coverage of visible heads of states, I do think what's happening at the same time is that women in junior and mid-career leadership roles across all sectors are being squeezed out of leadership pipelines because of what we just mentioned before. So what my hope is that this collective enthusiasm for positive examples of female leadership during the pandemic will actually translate into sustained attention to the pipeline of female talent, so that we actually see more of this in the future rather than less of this.
Yeah, great point. Let's certainly hope so. Now, Elena, you touched on this earlier, but you mentioned intersectionality. Of course, race and ethnicity are areas where recent events have really laid bare the need to make a lot more progress at greater speed in terms of getting ethnic diversity into leadership and creating more inclusive cultures. To what degree do you think the learnings from your work working on gender and studying gender for many years, to what degree can they be applied to help the ethnicity question? And maybe, you know, what differences do you see? Susan, let me start with you.
Yeah, it definitely is a much more challenging area. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I sit on the John Parker Review, and one of the big issues, the immediate challenge, is how do you actually measure that data? What do you call it? We on the Parker Review picked up the American term people of colour. In the UK, the common term is BAME, Black and Ethnic Minority. The problem is, by sticking everyone in that category, we know it masks huge differences, particularly the lack of opportunities for Black people. So I think one of the big concerns at the moment is just trying to grapple with the language and understand how you break it down. I mean, what we have seen in our research this summer, Elena and myself, is that a number of companies are not only setting targets for the BAME population, but also in particular the Black one. So I think, but Elena, you've had a lot to do with this whole conversation on race and ethnicity. So
what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of scope to apply those learnings, and but are organizations ready to do that? I'm not sure yet. What we found in our research on targets is that although gender targets were generally accepted and widely used, that's not the case for ethnicity targets. And if you look across organizations, you'll find much fewer that actually have ethnicity targets and are comfortable setting them. So, you know, I think organizations do need to challenge themselves on why this remains the case. Why are we comfortable talking about gender targets and not ethnicity targets? I don't think gender targets can be fully inclusive without addressing ethnicity for the simple fact that not all women are white, and the career experiences of women of color can be radically different. And so we need a more intersectional approach to, D&I in general, to target setting, and we need to get more comfortable with articulating racial issues in the workplace.
And what do you make of the word BAME? Does it work for you, or do you share Susan's concerns?
I do think there's a problem with aggregating different groups that have different experience under the same umbrella, because you're masking different levels of disadvantage. But at the same time, I think, we do need to talk about differences between white people and non-white people. So we need language that allows us to do that, because it's not all the same. And we also need language that allows us to examine and articulate white privilege, which I think is a very kind of painful point to raise in the workplace today.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. Well, I want to open it up for questions. And the first one comes from Jonathan. And he says, I come from a very heavily male-dominated work life. I'm glad I'm not there now. But one thing I have noticed is the decision-making process women go through is very different from men. I think there are circumstances where women can make better decisions in high-pressure areas than men. What are your thoughts? Susan?
Well, I'm not here saying women are better decision makers or better leaders than men. I think what all the evidence suggests, as you said earlier, Anne, is it's the diversity of perspectives and views. So we know from all the research that's been done on boards that bringing gender diversity to the board, how it gets enriched is the dynamics on the board. So, for example, at board level, women are much more likely to challenge and clarify and, go through those kinds of questionings, which men tend not to do. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's enriching the conversation. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that women are better decision makers. I think that they actually bring a different dynamic to the table.
Yes, so it's about having that diversity. And by the way, if you want to ask a question, type it into the chat box, please, and then we'll try and get to it. So what do you make about the women making better decisions under pressure, Elena? Do you think that's true?
Well, I would just bring back the point we made earlier about using evidence. I think, not being afraid to say when you don't know everything, mm-hmm. Not having this self-sufficient and overly confident attitude. And by the way, this issue of confidence, I'm tired of hearing people describe women as underconfident. I do think we need to name it, that sometimes male decision makers are overconfident. And I think that is actually a problem in decision making, especially high decision making. So I think, just bringing that different lens, that different style of questioning, perhaps different listening skills, can just complement the leadership skills in a team.
Yeah, great point. Next question here is from Maria. Just curious to understand if you found that having targets made women subsequently appointed to boards feel any less confident. There we go, confidence. I just wonder if your target could undermine their self-confidence. I have to start with you on that, Anna.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question. I will make 2 points on that. So first, we haven't spoken in this particular study to the women themselves, but what I would say is that it boils down to how we frame the targets. Again, if we frame them as these tools that undermine meritocracy, if we don't address head-on the discussion about meritocracy, then people will have this perception and women might internalize it. But we need to address the fact that we don't have a meritocracy now, and that's why we need tools like targets. Second, what I would say is evidence from countries such as Norway. I have colleagues, co-authors who are doing extensive research there, and are finding that, there was a lot of pushback initially when they introduced targets on boards years ago, and then they become accepted, and there isn't this stigma anymore, and everybody understands that they bring value rather than take value away from boards. So I think, the attitudes are a little bit more perhaps rigid before we introduce such tools, and then they become normalized and this stigma doesn't exist anymore.
Okay, well, let's hope that happens quickly also with ethnicity. Susan, what do you think? Well, this is the target question. Do you think they undermine confidence?
I do. I think what people have to realize is that from our extensive research on targets is targets aren't plucked out of thin air. they're based on the data, the size of the talent pool. So I think what people need to realize is that if you look at the whole pipeline, that women are disadvantaged from the first promotion onwards, that simply they are not promoted at this, in the same proportion to their talent, size of their talent pool compared to men, which is why we end up with, you know, entry level in most major organizations, it's roughly at parity, 50-50 male female. And yet at the top level, suddenly 90% are men. So, you know, is it that we've made these terrible mistakes of the women we've discovered are completely incompetent, but the men we've totally underestimated? I don't think so.
No.
So I think the whole point about targets and the way that Elena and I have seen them being used in companies is to set them relative to the size of the talent pool. So I don't think any woman should consider that she's actually just been tokenistically promoted. She hasn't. She has had to meet the criteria set, and it's just we are making up for it, as Elena said, what is a very uneven field at the moment.
Yes, and that shape that you described, 50% at the bottom and, you know, 10% at the top, we call that the glass pyramid, right?
Yeah.
At CMI, because we know, you're right, most companies have equal hires, men and women. Women are half the population, right? You would expect talent to be roughly evenly distributed, but yet as they get, as you said, you know, they get far less promoted. We did a study that showed actually 40% less likely to get promoted than their male counterparts. And that's the issue that needs addressing through targets. Okay, next question from Amelia. We hear so much about research showing how greater diversity on leadership teams creates better outcomes. But sometimes I get put on the spot and need a simple one-liner. What would you recommend I say when asked to explain the need for diversity on boards? So what's the elevator pitch for Amelia? What do you think, Susan?
Oh, that's an interesting one, because actually, you know, what we've now decided on the big public reviews is we don't even bother trying to defend diversity, because there's such a stream of evidence to demonstrate how diversity actually kind of pays dividends, not only in financial terms, but non-financially as well, corporate philanthropy and all sorts of other activities. It's very interesting that, as I said, having that diversity of gender, which is what we focus on, actually really is very beneficial. So, you know, I'm shocked that the question even comes up, actually. I don't know where she works, but...
Well, talk about the diversity dividend and, you know, right. That's, you're right. There's extensive evidence. So great. Elena, what's your advice? What would you tell this?
I agree with both of your points, but I'm just going to be provocative here and suggest to Amelia and anyone who hears the question to flip it back to the person asking and ask, you know, why is it that we need to justify the presence of women, minorities, and other underrepresented groups in leadership teams, and all while male boards just get to be without being challenged?
Yeah,
you know,
that's a great point. We've never done, you know, we've never questioned the effectiveness of all male boards, right?
Yeah.
So why?
Exactly. So I think there is implicit prejudice in the question. I know it's a question that gets asked a lot. I understand why the person raises it, but I think we need to confront and challenge the people who ask this question, because it really does show how, you know, there is an extra burden to justify your existence at certain ranks in the organization, which really shouldn't be there anymore.
Great point. A question from Victoria. Do you believe that the acceleration of work from home due to COVID will help to drive women into higher positions in the longer term? What do you think, Susan?
I'm hoping so. I mean, I do think that we are definitely going to see a kind of evolving change in the structure of work. I mean, I think working from home, working flexibly, and if I can mention another structure of work, which I think is completely underused, is job sharing. And, you know, it's much more picked up and developed in the public sector. But I think as we see jobs disappear, I just wonder just how many people would really value actually sharing a very senior role with another colleague. So I am hoping, that this really, we do actually kind of benefit from this mandatory experiment that everyone's had to do for all these months of working from home, of actually realizing it can work. But of course, not everyone has the right home situations to work. And I think we do need to reach out to give the necessary support.
Yeah, it's a great point. Elena, what do you think? Is it going to help the work from home in the longer term?
I think it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, I think, there are opportunities, there are ways in which it could help, but also if we look at the uneven share of caring and domestic responsibilities that persists, I think that's actually going to impact negatively the progression of women into senior positions. And this is where, when we talk about gender equality at work, we really can't separate it from gender equality in society at large and at home. And, I say this over and over again, we're never going to have an equal playing field in the workplace unless we make families more equal. And why is it that women still pick up this disproportionate share of responsibilities at home? I think we need a societal review as well in terms of the gender roles we see.
Well, okay, here's a very broad question to end on. It's from Mayank. It's great to hear about some progress being made amongst the UK FTSE 100. What lessons do you think could be learned in emerging economies? Great question to end on. Susan, what lessons can we learn?
Well, I think there is actually quite a lot of interest across the different countries, and countries are looking to one another. So, I was just talking to someone in Nigeria this morning, and I know that there's a very great appetite for learning from the UK and the other bigger economies as to what they should do. And we shouldn't always think that we lead the way. Actually, some of the emerging economies are doing some very interesting things themselves. So I think we're in this together. I always say that we have to be very careful comparing one country with another because they're very different cultures and histories and backgrounds. So, we do have to be mindful that I think each country has to decide on its own what's their best path. But I think there's a lot of learning backwards and forwards. We shouldn't just think of emerging economies learning from us. I think it also works the other way around as well.
Absolutely. Elena, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's very localized and contextual. I think there's learning to be shared, but also to think locally, in a way about what are your levers for change. The UK is a particular kind of national and cultural context where there's, I would say, quite high reluctance to government intervention. So you have a lot of other national settings where there's greater societal acceptance of broader frameworks for gender equality, socially and at work. And when that lever is present, I would say use it if that's what works there, right? Because the reason we have ended up with this voluntary approach here is because of the reluctance to impose state-driven quotas. So you really have to think very contextually about who are the stakeholders that can drive the change and how you can kind of join them up and make that change happen.
Great. Well, thank you both for a really fascinating discussion and for your wonderful report. We'll certainly include a link to it when we publish our blog and when we put this broadcast up. Thank you all for joining us. And if you'd like to join the CMI community, please click also on the box in the chat. And thanks again, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Susan and Elena.